If you were the treasurer of your country, how would you manage your nation's resources? What would you do in times of plenty when things are going well? And what would you do in times of famine? That's the question we're going to ask today, which is how does our body manage its biochemical resources? We're going to talk about the fed state and the fasting state and all of the biochemical reactions that happen in our body to manage our biochemical resources. So, we're going to talk about the three pillars, the three macronutrients of metabolism. We'll talk about the fed state versus the fasting state. We'll talk about hormonal control of metabolism, that's insulin and glucagon. We'll look at diabetes as a metabolic case study, and we'll look at the case of extreme starvation. What do we do in times of extreme famine, biochemically speaking? So, lots of exciting biochemistry to learn. So, let's get into part one, to what I call the three pillars of metabolic biochemistry. So, what are the three pillars of metabolic biochemistry? Well, remember these guys? Yes, these are our four major macromolecules that make up all of life. Well, get rid of nucleic acid, we're going to ignore it. I hate it. It can flip right off. I can't swear, that's unprofessional, but we're going to ignore nucleic acids. It's not a source of energy. And now on to my three lovelies. These are our three major macronutrients: lipids, carbohydrates, and protein. These are the fuels that we can burn and use for energy. So let's have a look at that. I want to lay down a few basic facts about these three pillars. So I'm going to give you a little quiz, okay? The first question is, what is the basic building blocks of each fuel source? So the basic building blocks of carbohydrates is, you got it is glucose. Hopefully you got that, but that's okay if not. What's the basic building block of lipid? Well, you might remember that lipid is made up of glycerol, which is the backbone, and the fatty acids, the three fatty acids which attach onto that. So glycerol and fatty acids are the basic building blocks of fat or lipids. And then finally, protein, the basic building block is amino acids. All right, easy days. Now, I'm going to flip that question and ask, what are the storage forms of each fuel source? We've got the basic building blocks, which we can burn and use for fuel, but what if we want to store them up? And so I'm going to introduce to you the three storage forms. So for glucose, we can store that as glycogen. Glycogen is a really tightly packed ball of glucose. For lipids, glycerol and fatty acids are put together as fat or triglycerides. And so fat or triglycerides is the storage form. And similarly, for amino acids can make whole proteins. And so we store amino acids in the form of whole proteins. So we've got our building blocks, we've got our storage forms, and the next question I want to ask is, in which organ is each macronutrient stored? Well, where is glycogen stored? Glycogen is stored in the liver. The liver is the great guardian of glucose, the glucose guardian. And that's where it protects all the stores of glucose, the glycogen. I just want to note that we can also find glycogen in our muscles, and our muscles have their own glycogen stores, but we're going to ignore that. For the sake of making our biochemical framework, let's just think of the liver as the guardian of glucose. Next, where is fat stored? Well, fat is stored in our fat tissue, which is called adipose tissue. Now, I've drawn a little sumo wrestler person there with lots of fat. That is where our triglycerides are stored. And the adipose tissue is the guardian of fat. Okay? And then lastly, where is protein stored? Well, our big storage of protein is in our skeletal muscle. So I've drawn this huge bodybuilder looking buff person, and protein is stored in the skeletal muscles. So skeletal muscles is the guardian of protein. So these three organs are the guardians of each of their respective macronutrient. So just summarizing that concept, we have carbs, lipids, and proteins, the three pillars of metabolic biochemistry. Carbohydrates are made of glucose, which can be stored as glycogen in the liver, the guardian of glucose. Lipids are made of glycerol and fatty acids, which can be stored as triglycerides in the adipose tissue, which is the guardian of fat. And finally, proteins are made of amino acids, which are stored as whole proteins in skeletal muscles, the guardian of protein. And so every single biochemical reaction that we think about from now on, I want you to think in terms of these three pillars. What's happening to the carbs, what's happening to the lipids, and what's happening to the proteins. Okay, you got that? Let's go. Part 2, the fed state versus the fasting state. What do we do when things are plentiful, and what do we do when we are in need? So, there are two main metabolic states that we find ourselves in, the fed state and the fasting state. The fed state is when there is lots of fuel around. So for example, you've had lunch, you've had a nice delicious meal, maybe you've had some pasta, maybe you've had a nice steak, maybe you've had some teriyaki tofu with a side salad, whatever it is, you now have lots of fuel floating around in your bloodstream, ready to be used. So that's the fed state. The opposite is the fasting state, where there is no fuel around. For example, let's say you've slept for 8 hours, you haven't eaten anything whilst you slept, and you wake up in the morning. There is no fuel floating around in your bloodstream, so you are considered to be in the fasting state. So let's look at the biochemistry of the fed state and then the fasting state. So first, the fed state. Here's our model of a fed state person. And you've just had a nice big meal and you've absorbed lots of nutrients into your bloodstream. What do you need to do? Well, you have lots of nutrients, and what you need to do is you need to store them. We need to store our nutrients. So let's think about this through the lens of our three pillars. First of all, carbohydrates. Glucose we need to store as glycogen in the liver. Fatty acids we need to store as fat or triglycerides in our adipose tissue. And amino acids we are going to build up into proteins in our skeletal muscle. Now, each of these processes have a fancy biochemical name. So, the process of making glycogen is called glycogenesis. The process of making fat or triglycerides is called lipogenesis. And the process of making proteins is called protein synthesis. Now, I searched up, there is a term proteogenesis, but I don't think anyone uses that, so we just say protein synthesis. Genesis means to make, and so glycogenesis is making glycogen. Lipogenesis is to make lipo. Lipo is Greek for fat, or Latin for fat, one of those old dead languages, and protein synthesis obviously is to make protein. So in the fed state, we perform these three biochemical reactions. In the fasting state, that's the opposite. So here's a model of a fasting state person, and let's say you haven't eaten for 12 hours. There's no more nutrients in your bloodstream. What do you need to do? Well, we need to access our stored fuel. And the word for that is mobilization. So we need to mobilize our fuel. So glycogen, we want to release and break it down into glucose so that we can use it. Fat from the adipose tissue needs to be broken down into fatty acids. And protein in the muscles need to be broken down into the amino acids. Now, I just want to say, our body will primarily break down glycogen and fat, and we only break down protein as a very last resort, because protein is very precious and we don't want to be breaking that down. So we only do that in a dire emergency. Again, these three processes have fancy biochemical names. So breaking down glycogen into glucose is called glycogenolysis. Breaking fat down into fatty acids is called lipolysis, and breaking protein down is called proteolysis. So the suffix lysis means to break down. So glycogenolysis is breaking down glycogen, lipolysis is breaking down lipo, fat, and proteolysis is breaking down protein. So this is the fed and fast state. In the fed state, we want to store nutrients, whereas in the fasting state, we want to mobilize nutrients. And so I've drawn orange arrows to represent the fed state, where we have glycogenesis, lipogenesis, and protein synthesis. And in the opposite direction, during the fasting state, what we do is we release the stored forms and we mobilize those nutrients for use. So in the blue arrows, we have glycogenolysis, lipolysis, and proteolysis. I just want to note that all the orange arrows, where we store up nutrients and build up our building blocks into larger molecules, that is called an anabolic reaction. So anabolic reactions are building things up. When we're breaking things down in the blue arrows, we call those catabolic reactions. And so catabolic reactions break things down. You might have heard of anabolic steroids, which is what gym junkies might take and bodybuilders might take to help them build up muscle in particular. So anabolic and catabolic, fed versus fast state. Clear as mud? All right. So next question is, how does our body know when to perform the anabolic reactions? And how does it know when to perform the catabolic reactions? Well, here we get to part 3, hormones. Hormones control all of this. And so I've called part 3, hormonal regulation of metabolism. Our metabolism is controlled by 2 main hormones. The first is insulin, which is the well-fed hormone, and the second is glucagon, the starvation hormone. So, how does your body know when to store or mobilize fuel? All these reactions are controlled by these 2 hormones. Insulin, which pushes fuel into storage, and glucagon, which causes fuel to be released from their storage to be mobilized. So let's talk about each of these in turn. First of all, insulin, the well-fed hormone. When your blood glucose level is high, so let's say you've eaten a meal, you've absorbed all that glucose into your bloodstream and you have high blood glucose, your pancreas will sense that and it releases insulin into your bloodstream. And this is what happens. It will cause all those beautiful anabolic reactions to happen: glycogenesis, lipogenesis, and protein synthesis. It wants to take these building blocks floating around in your cells and absorb them into your cells to build up into these storage molecules. Essentially, insulin acts as a key. It opens up the cells, it allows the nutrients to flow in, and then it activates all the biochemical machinery that performs the anabolic reactions. So it lets the glucose flow into the liver and to make glycogen. It lets the fatty acids flow into the adipose fat cells and get turned into fat. And it allows amino acids to enter into the skeletal muscle cells to make protein. Insulin is a key that unlocks the cell and activates the storage of nutrients. So that's insulin. Glucagon is the opposite. Glucagon is the starvation hormone. So it's the opposite of insulin, and it releases when there is low blood sugar. So let's say you've slept for 10 hours, your blood sugar drops down because you haven't eaten for 10 hours. Your pancreas will sense that and it will release glucagon. And it causes all the catabolic reactions to happen. So glycogen starts breaking down into glucose, fat starts breaking down into fatty acids, and in dire circumstances, protein breaks down into amino acids. Glucagon has a few friends. There are a few other hormones that glucagon is in cahoots with, and those are cortisol, adrenaline, and growth hormone. Collectively, glucagon, along with its friends, are called the counter-regulatory hormones. That's because they counter insulin, and these hormones will activate your cells to release lots of energy for use. And so glucagon releases energy for use when we're in the starving state, and insulin will cause nutrients to be stored up during the well-fed state. Now, the important thing to say is insulin and glucagon work together, right? They're actually team members rather than 2 opposing forces. Let me show you some graphs. This is what our blood sugar, or in general, the nutrients available in our bloods would look like without the hormones. You eat some breakfast and whoosh, all this rushes up and then it gets absorbed down. And then at lunch, when you eat another meal, it rushes up and it comes down. And in dinner, it rushes up and comes down. So your nutrient availability would correlate with your food intake. However, we need energy 24 hours of the day, right? And so what glucagon and insulin together do is that they level this out so that you have all your nutrients in a narrow range in your bloodstream at all times. When the nutrients go up, insulin brings it into the cells and keeps it from going too high. And when it starts to drop down, glucagon kicks in to maintain a steady state of nutrients in your bloodstream. So together, insulin and glucagon convert an irregular food supply into a near constant supply of nutrients, which is a very, very clever system. So insulin acts on the fed state, glucagon acts on the fasting state, and together these work to keep a near constant supply of nutrients. Whew, that's a lot. So Now we've reached part 4 where we start talking about what can go wrong. And I want to talk about the diabetes. Without insulin, we ruin our control over metabolism. Yo, why are we talking about diabetes? Well, that's a really good question, little green creature. I want to say that diabetes is an interesting case study. It shows us what happens when our metabolism goes out of whack. Now, if you're not familiar with diabetes, there are 2 different types. Type 1 diabetes is caused by an insulin deficiency. Your pancreas gets destroyed at a young age due to some autoimmune process, and you can't make insulin anymore. So that's type 1 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes is an issue of insulin resistance. This often happens because of things like obesity, and having a lot of fat on board causes your insulin to become less sensitive. So even though you do have insulin, the insulin is not working. In either case, you get not enough insulin activity. And so that's what diabetes is all about. So what's wrong with having no insulin? We can ask the average Joe and say, "Hey Joe, what's the problem with diabetes?" And you take anyone off the street and they'd probably say, "Oh, diabetes is when you don't have insulin, and so your blood sugar level goes up." Now, Joe here is not wrong, right? That is right. You don't have insulin and your blood sugar goes up. But he's only getting the surface level picture. It's like saying, "Oh, my car's broken. What's wrong?" And Joe says, I know what's wrong. The engine is making smoke." And you realize, oh, actually, yeah, that's not wrong. But actually, there's something inside the engine that's broken. And so we need to ask an expert, which is you. And so here's you. And you are a scholar. Note these scholarly glasses. It means you're really smart. And I'll ask you, well, what's the problem with having no insulin? And because you've studied this metabolic biochemistry course, you say to me, well, actually, a lack of insulin means that no fuel can enter our cells and we lose the ability to store fuel. And you realize, oh, yeah, that's right. Insulin acts as a key. If you don't have a key, your fuel can't get into your cells. And then, moreover, this leads to a deficit in fed state metabolism and an excess of fasting state metabolism. A true disaster, if I do say so myself. So let's have a look at what happens to our fed and fasting state metabolism. With no insulin, what happens to our fed state metabolism, driven by insulin? Well, all these storage processes, you get none of those. You lose the ability to take up nutrients into the cells and store the fuel. And what happens is that all nutrients and glucose are stuck outside of the cell. There is no key, right? They can't get in and you can't store them up. What happens to our fasting state metabolism, driven by glucagon? Well, because you have no insulin and an excess of glucagon activity, all these breakdown processes become very, very rampant. You get an excess of fuel breakdown and fuel mobilization. And all fuel sources are relentlessly breaking down because it thinks you are starving. Your cells aren't receiving the insulin signal to store things, and so it thinks, oh, you must be really hungry. And so glycogen is breaking down, fat is breaking down, protein is breaking down. It thinks you are really, really hungry. And so that's the problem with having no insulin, right? And so again, here's you, a scholar. In summary, a lack of insulin leads to extreme starvation metabolism. And that's what happens in diabetes. It's mimicking extreme starvation. But it's weird because you have all this nutrient around, yet your body thinks it's starving. And so some people call this starvation in the face of plenty, which I think is a really apt description. I think that's really cool. So this brings us to our final part of today's lesson, which is extreme starvation. Like, what happens when this gets really, really bad? So let me introduce my third character in a nice shade of purple. This person is very, very hungry. Now I've got a question for you. In starvation, which one of our 3 macronutrients is most important, and why? The answer is it is glucose. Glucose is the most important of our 3 pillars. Why is that? Well, it is because our brain can only use glucose. Our brain cells cannot burn fatty acids and it cannot burn amino acids. It is a very fussy organ. and it is the most important organ that takes priority. And so our body will try and keep the brain happy. And it does this by trying to maximize glucose at the expense of fat and protein. So, how do we maximize glucose? This person is very hungry and needs lots and lots of glucose. So, luckily, the liver has a few tricks up its sleeve to help with the task of maximizing glucose. So, let me introduce three chemical reactions: glycogenolysis, gluconeogenesis, and ketogenesis. They're all a mouthful. But let me take you through these. Glycogenolysis, you've already heard of, right? It's breaking down stored glucose. So glycogen stores in the liver will be broken down into glucose. So that's a part of normal starvation metabolism, but in extreme starvation will break down lots and lots of glycogen. The second trick it has is a thing called gluconeogenesis. And this is making new glucose from other macronutrients. You'll see gluco meaning sugar, neo meaning new, so new sugar genesis, the creation of new sugar. And so what we want to do is take things from the lipid pillar and the protein pillar and shift that into glucose. And so what we can do is we can take a glycerol from the triglyceride, the backbone, and we can take amino acids. And then our liver has biochemical processes that turn those into glucose. So now we're shunting things towards glucose. Finally, we have ketogenesis. This is the technique of making something else that the brain will accept. Now, I lied about the brain only accepting glucose. There is one other fuel source that the brain will accept, and it is a thing called ketone bodies, ketones. And the way we make ketones is by taking fatty acids, and then our liver, under the process of ketogenesis, will turn it into ketone bodies. And this can go up into your brain, where your brain cells can use it. The pros of this is that you make fuel for your brain, but the cons of this is that ketone bodies are acidic, and so it can really acidify your blood, and that can make you really, really ill. So that's extreme starvation metabolism. So let me summarize again those three processes. In the liver, we have glycogen stores, right? The liver is the guardian of glucose, and glycogenolysis breaks that into glucose. In the skeletal muscle, the guardian of protein, proteins are broken down via proteolysis into amino acids, and then the amino acids travel to the liver, where the liver will perform gluconeogenesis and turn those amino acids into glucose. Finally, adipose tissue, the guardian of fat. Fat in the form of triglyceride undergoes lipolysis, breaking it down into glycerol backbones and free fatty acids. The glycerol will go to the liver, and the liver will take that and turn it into new glucose via gluconeogenesis. So glycerol into glucose. And then finally, the fatty acid component of fat goes again to the liver where everything happens, and the liver takes it and undergoes ketogenesis to make it into a ketone body. The outcome is lots and lots of glucose and ketones for your brain to use. So this is what happens in extreme starvation. So in extreme diabetes, what happens? Well, this person's diabetes is getting out of hand. They have no insulin. They're experiencing extreme starvation in the face of plenty. They are ravenously breaking down fuel and mobilizing fuel. And this is leading to a dangerously high level of glucose and ketones. And this is a state known as diabetic ketoacidosis. It's a diabetic emergency, and commonly, the first time someone finds out they have type 1 diabetes is when they get really, really sick with diabetic ketoacidosis. And it's called ketoacidosis because your blood becomes very acidic from all the ketones. Now, you can also end up in this state if you don't eat anything for days on end. If you are completely starving, your body will undergo the same processes, and it will, break down fuel and create lots of ketones, and you can become ketoacidotic this way. In that state, we don't call it diabetic ketoacidosis, we call that starvation ketoacidosis. But it's the same physiology, same biochemistry. Holy hell, that is a lot of biochemistry. It sure is, little green creature. Let's summarize. So, in summary, we talked about our three pillars of biochemistry: carbohydrates, fats, and amino acids. And we talked about the anabolic and catabolic processes that go between the building blocks and their storage form. In the fed state, we have all these orange arrows. We build up our building blocks into their storage forms, and insulin drives this process. In the fasting state, we're going to do the opposite. We're going to break down our stored forms into the building blocks so that we can use as fuel, and glucagon drives this process. And then finally, in extreme starvation, our liver has a few strategies to maximize glucose, and that's glycogenolysis, gluconeogenesis, and ketogenesis. And so this one slide summarizes all the biochemical reactions that we've talked about today and the situations which this occurs. Great work on making it towards the end. Here is a written summary of the 3 macronutrients, the 3 anabolic reactions, the 3 catabolic reactions, as well as all the stuff about diabetes and insulin and extreme starvation. So, great work on getting to the end of this. It was a big lesson. Take your time to digest this, and I'll see you in the next video for our final lesson.